Hello, how's it going, Miko?
It's going well. Happy to be back. Happy Tuesday after a long holiday weekend. How's it going for you?
Going well. We're back for our, I think, fourth installment of Mindful Techie Tuesdays.
This is the fourth installment, so time is flying.
Time is flying. Excited to be back on. Took a few days off because of the Memorial Day holiday. Spent some time with family. How about yourself?
Took a little downtime as well, so just pretty low key, restful here and on the East Coast.
It's good. As I queue up, we have a special guest today. As I queue her up to come on, would you mind maybe starting to share about like what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about self-care, specifically in the context of everything that's happening right now. So, what is self-care and what does that actually look like in the context of crisis and uncertainty that we've been experiencing over the past several weeks, and in the context of really a lot of trauma that we have experienced to some degree. And so, we have a very special guest, a friend, colleague, Aisha Moore. She is the founder and CEO of Self-Care by Aisha, and she is an expert on self-care and burnout, particularly as it relates to senior women in leadership. And so we're excited to be able to have this wide-ranging conversation about this topic of self-care. What does it mean? What does it mean in this particular context? And what are some really practical things that we can do, to put those things into practice, to take care of ourselves? And what are the myths, and what are the things we can demystify about what self-care is and what it isn't? So excited to have Aisha here to join us as part of this conversation.
Hey,
Hi,
Aisha.
hi, Carlos. Hi, Miko. Thank you for having me today.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here, and we're excited to have you. So, Carlos, as we kick things off, is there anything else you want to add before I dive in with Aisha?
Well, first of all, just welcome to our viewers that are catching us here on live. We're on LinkedIn Live. Please send in any comments or thoughts that you might have to this conversation. And if you're catching us on replay, thank you. Aisha, I'm excited to hear what you got for us today. Looking forward to this conversation, and I'll be popping in here in and out.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you, Carlos, for setting up this beautiful studio. We're excited to be here, and thank you for putting it all together and making sure that it is all running smoothly. So, Aisha, we're gonna go ahead and just dive in here. So, tell us a little bit about. First of all, let's check in with you. How are you doing in this current environment? I know we're hearing a lot in the news and on social media about the range of different ways people are responding to or been impacted by what's happening. But how are you doing right now?
I think, even for a person like me who practices self-care all the time, that didn't pretty stressful, but I could recognize the signs in myself and decided to just go ahead and double down on my routines that I have, really track myself stress. And one of the signs I know of stress is not being able to sleep. So I really actually practice good sleep hygiene during this time.
Mm. Well, awesome. So thank you for sharing that. And so you've already dropped a couple of nuggets I want to come back to in our conversation. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about the work that you do specifically, and tell us how you got started on this journey, because you have a story that actually brought you to the work that you're doing today, right?
Yes. So I help senior level working women avoid or recover from burnout. And I do that because I had my own burnout experience and it was awful. Some people, I've heard other people do a euphemism and say, you unraveled, right? So I unraveled. And I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through, miss the signs, and really feel helpless the way that I did. Because what happened to me is preventable, right? It was totally preventable. But there were some things that I needed to know. There are some things that I needed to do differently. And I'm continuing to do those things because I have learned that self-care is not a goal, it is a habit.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into that. So you said self-care is not a goal, it's a habit. So what is self-care?
So self-care is a personal practice and practice every day, a daily habit that builds our resilience. And it is to focus on feeling better emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and physically. So some things I want to point out in that definition is that it's personal. Like self-care for each person is going to be different. It's a daily practice. So it's something we do every day, whether we wake up feeling great or we wake up feeling bad. We need to practice self-care all of those days. And then it's not just about the physical, right? Some people think about the physical in terms of exercise. People think about manicures and pedicures and getting your eyebrows done. And ladies, if that was your only self-care, then we got to expand the notion of what that is, because right now a lot of us don't have access to that. I've tried to paint my nails 3 times. I am not good at it. Don't have that hand-eye coordination. And if having fabulous nails was the only thing in my life that was self-care, I would be doing pretty poorly right now. So just want people to understand it's for all types of things: spiritual, mental, physical, emotional.
Okay. So now we have a definition of what self-care is. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about, you talk about resilience, and when we talk about resilience, you mentioned something that I think is really important. And I talk about this in the context of the work that I do with work-life balance, which is that there's no such thing as a stress-free or pain-free or challenge-free life. We all have challenges. The question is, how are we responding to the challenges as they come up? So can you expound upon that when you talk about self-care as a habit that you're using to build resilience?
So we're live, so I couldn't go like wash my, do something else with my eye, guys. And it's COVID time, so I have my issues. So you guys have to excuse me. My eye is itching right now.
We appreciate you.
So that, we're live. Yeah, so I'm sorry, Miko, I just lost track with that. What was your question?
Oh, good. So I was just asking you to dive deeper into this concept that when we talk about self-care, like what you're doing right now in this moment, we're talking about building resilience, recognizing that there's no such thing as a stress-free or pain-free life, right? So can you dive a little bit deeper into that? Because I think many folks, when we think about self-care, we think about, okay, if I do these things, then I'm setting myself up to avoid having difficult moments.
Yes.
Right?
So stress happens every day, and self-care needs to happen every day, because you don't want to go too long without fixing the problem, right? So in most things, when a problem happens, we try to remedy it immediately. But when it comes to stressful situations, we often let them linger. Okay. And so I agree with you, Miko. I do not believe in stress-free living. And people are often surprised when I say that. And I say that because, especially as people of color and as a woman, there's always going to be, no matter how great I am with what I do, there's always going to be, and maybe I should be more optimistic. Maybe one day there won't be racism, sexism, homophobia, that kind of thing, right? So you just never know when it is that things are going to happen, and only thing you can control is your behaviors. So with practicing self-care every day, what you're doing is you are letting your body know that you love it, right? And like letting your central nervous system know that it's okay. Because at the end of the day, when we get stressed, we go back to that fight, flight, or freeze situation that is based from our basic biological response to stress. And so as a result, we have to practice letting our body know, our central nervous system know that it's okay, right? That you're not going to let it be in danger for too long. And so although we're not running after a tiger, right, that same stress response that we have when we're running late, when we're overwhelmed, when we're tired, when we're exhausted, we have that same physical stress response. And so our body does not know, it's not really aware that the threat is not the lion chasing us, right? It just knows that it's under threat and it reacts accordingly. So being under sustained stress can really break the body down. And under sustained stress, your body forgets how to take care of itself to become unstressed. You don't even get the same reactions. You become numb to the stress. So you don't even see the signs. And so with practicing self-care every day, what we're doing is becoming more resilient, right? So when stress does happen, because it's gonna happen, what I have found is I don't get as stressed as often because I am making sure that I'm accounting for that in my daily living and my daily happens. And when it does, it doesn't take me out anymore. It doesn't send me to bed for days. It doesn't send me on short-term disability like it did and before I got to this point in my life. And so that's, to me, what resilience is having the ability to deal with stress as it comes. And when it does come, you know exactly what to do, exactly what you're feeling. You're like, oh, I'm feeling stress. And as opposed to like, I'm feeling some kind of way, because people say that all the time, feeling some kind of way. It's like, well, how are you actually feeling, right? You're feeling stress, and say that and do something about it. And I think when you practice self-care every day, I know immediately when something's off. It is not a mystery to me when stress is happening. And I'm clear on what it is that I should do about it. Because as we know, there's like 1,000 things we could do for self-care and stress management. But I know what the go-tos are for me because I practice every day. I tried lots of things until I settled in with works for me. And so that's what everyone needs to do. Try lots of things until you figure out what works for you.
So I want to come back to this later in the conversation. And I really want to talk about starting places for people that are new to this conversation. Maybe they're rethinking this conversation based on what you've shared with us so far. So I do want to talk about that and concrete strategies. But before we do that, I want to dive deeper to something that you said, which is that when we're under perpetual stress, right, the body doesn't know the difference between the types of stress. The body simply knows that it has to respond or that it is responding. And you said that it can reach a point, if I heard you correctly, where it can overwhelm our ability to respond. And that would be one way that I would define trauma, right? So when you're experiencing a series of events that overwhelm your ability to actually cope with whatever it is that you're experiencing. So is there a connection between not taking care of yourself and trauma? How do you, is there, or am I just making a...
Yeah. So I don't have an exact answer for you, but I actually just ordered 2 books from the Trauma Stewardship Institute because I was actually interested in that.
Okay.
So one of them is called The Age of Overwhelm, Strategies for the Long Haul. And the second one is called Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. So actually, we can do this again. And after I read the book, I can give you the answer. But what that says to me is the fact that the book is called Trauma Stewardship. Yeah. Means that there must be a connection. I just don't have all the details because those are my next books that I'm going to read. Okay, so we'll have you back on to talk about that once you've read those books. But I mean, what I can share is having done trauma-informed training from a mindfulness-based approach. One of the things we know is that, to your point about the perpetual stress, if it gets to a point where it's actually overwhelming our ability to be able to actually deal with or to be resilient, right? That can be a form of trauma that has to probably be dealt with in a different way. But to bring us back to the conversation, you mentioned that you work with women specifically, and I'm wondering if you can speak to why women, and if there are differences that you've observed in terms of how men and women approach these conversations around self-care. Yes, I definitely have noticed a difference. And because when I speak, oftentimes I'm speaking from a woman's perspective, from my experience. And when I have mixed crowds in the room, sometimes the men are like right on, other times they're like, I don't identify with this at all. And so there's a lot of things in the society that we were never specifically taught. There are ways of being, there's norms that we just sort of catch by seeing the way that our parents, our grandparents, are the people who taught us, our teachers, our professors, that they give off messages on how you should be. And so many of us model those things of how we should be unconsciously. We don't realize that we're mimicking things unconsciously. And so therefore, that's how another thing that we mimic unconsciously is how to take care of ourselves. So for many women, we're sometimes directly taught, but other times we just catch the fact that you should not put yourself first, that there should be everyone else comes first. Like I remember reading in Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and she talks about how she was very resentful of Barack for going to the gym, because she's like, I'm home with these kids and you got time to go to the gym? How you got time to go to the gym? And I don't. And then she realizes like, he just made time for it. He just did it, right? When her sort of the way she thought about things was that was an optional thing she could do if she had time. So I would say, so giving that example, that's what happens for a lot of women. Self-care is something you do when you have extra time, because often the things that we are taught are self-care are things like manicures, pedicures, massages, and, beauty routines, pampering, right? And so those things I believe are a part of the puzzle, but they should not be the whole puzzle. But for many women, they are the entire puzzle. So then of course, you're going to maybe feel guilt and shame for wanting to do those things because they seem frivolous, when we should be really thinking about things like time management, boundary setting, your mindset, joy, fulfillment, and things of that nature. And I think people would see it as less frivolous.
Yes.
If they expanded their notion of what self-care is. And just to give another quote, Audre Lorde talks about self-care as self-preservation. So
Yes.
we could change some more of self-care being self-preservation versus pampering, then I think people would look at it differently and wouldn't feel like it's feel guilty or feel like it's frivolous.
Yes. And so to this point about the thinking that in some spaces it feels or come across as frivolous, how much of this do you think is attributable to language, right? So because I when you talk about what self-care encompasses, it reminds me a lot of the conversations that I hear around work-life balance, conversations I hear around mindfulness, and even in the corporate setting, productivity, time and energy management, toward the goal of having a healthier, more focused and productive workforce. What's your sense of that when it comes to the language around self-care?
Yeah, I do think, I've thought about this a lot, as to whether I should be talking about, other types of things like you mentioned, like mindfulness, resiliency training, things of that nature. But I also don't want people to feel like it's so formal and that it is something you do for yourself, as opposed to a lot of times when you talk about work-life balance, right? Work is in there, productivity. I hear a lot of people talking more about productivity at work as opposed to being a productive, loving parent, right? So it's always it always gets tied to that piece of thing around work, and I just want to make sure that people expand it. So when I ask people what they're stressed about, right? Work is one of the top things that people are stressed about, but they're also stressed about personal relationships. They're stressed about finances, right? So I see it as, emotional health, financial health, all of these different things. And so I think some of the strategies may be the same, but I want to remind people that if one day you lost your job or you couldn't go off to work, like you still need to self-care no matter what. Yes.
So to that point, let's maybe steer the conversation toward some of the practical, right? So you mentioned at the first part of our conversation that for self-care is in part an individual thing, right? We have to try different strategies and figure out what works for us. But are there some common denominators, right? Because you mentioned time management and energy management, and you mentioned sleep. So I would imagine that sleep is a universal thing that we should all be doing in terms of diet and exercise. I would imagine those would be things too. Are there basic things that we should be doing no matter what those additional strategies are? Can you talk to that?
Yes. So I think people forgo the basics, right? So they're signing up for a 10-day meditation retreat, but they're already like not giving themselves enough time to sleep, just literally going to bed too late to get 8 hours of sleep. they're very, very dehydrated, and the fuel that they're feeding themselves is not the type of fuel that's going to make them sluggish, right? So people always like, some people come to me and they want to do all of these things, right? And I'm like, okay, but first we have to get you sleeping enough to have enough energy. And when it comes to hydration, it's so interesting. And this is kind of morbid, so forgive me. So, but someone said this to me because I was not a water drinker previously. And when they explained this to me, it revolutionized. So I want to share it. And for people who are terminally ill, right, and they decide that they want to die, a lot of times people refuse food, right? You can go 14 days without food, but you can only go three, maybe 4 days without water, right? And so a lot of us, I don't know the statistics, but a lot of people are perpetually dehydrated. So when you think about like just, 1 day without proper hydration, if you're going to die in 4 days, your body is feeling that by the first day, right? And so we forget, like, if we just drank water, that water, I've just learned so much how much water is like resilience, right?
Yes.
So hydration is resilience.
Liquid resilience.
Right, because you will be less irritable, you will be more focused, right? So people are like, can't meditate. I'm like, well, you know what? Let's drink water first, because that's going to be the first thing to help you focus. Right. So sometimes people forget about these basic things. And we're like, okay, got to sign up for this class. We got to take this course on happiness. We got to read this book. And meanwhile, if we just picked a bedtime that would allow us to have 8 hours of sleep, went to bed at that time, drank the appropriate amount of water, like those two things alone will just help us be able to deal with the stress as it comes. And so really, that's the free stuff, because the key thing is you don't want a bunch of your self-care to be things that you pay for.
Yes.
Because right now we're in a crisis in this country. There's so many people who have lost jobs. Millions of people have lost jobs. Earlier today, I was listening about how, since all the camps are going to be closed this summer, lifeguards, all these people who are planning to have jobs this summer, they will not have them. And so if you are only purchasing self-care and haven't figured out basic things like being able to stretch, meditate, walk around the block, journal, do arts and crafts, and then some other things, making sure that your life is not totally overwhelming or overscheduled. Like, those are a lot of things that we can do. So then when it's time to do the meditation, there's not as much on my mind. So I don't have to worry about settling my mind as much, because there's just not as much on my mind, because I've kind of solved that in my daily habits.
So that's a really good lead into my next question, which is around, so how expensive is healthcare? And I mean, not healthcare, but how expensive is self-care, which is a form of healthcare? And in the context of privilege, right? So is it I think most people probably associate it with the people of privilege, right? It's like certain people can afford to have the time, the energy, the financial resources to invest in self-care. So can you speak to that angle in terms of access and how much it costs?
So I'm not a Twitter person, but about 2 years ago, I got into a huge Twitter spat with Melissa Harris Perry, because she wrote an article called talking about squad care. So, right, caring for each other in a community. But she also basically dissed self-care and said self-care is not a requirement, right? And I was just like, what are you doing? And I don't even like Twitter, but I was going at her I was tearing her up. I was like, what are you talking about? And so one of her research assistants, wrote back and was like, well, some people can't self-care. And she was talking about exactly what you're saying, because in the model that they had put together, they put it together as a very privileged thing, right? And so self-care sometimes is reaching out for help, right? To say to somebody like, I need you to help me with X, Y, or Z, right? So you still get that communal thing, but asking for help so you're less overwhelmed, right? That is a way that you can self-care, right? Taking things off your plate, that is a way that you can self-care, because what I find is that for a lot of people, their life is just a hot mess, right? And so I came up with this acronym for HOT. It's hurried, overwhelmed, and tired, right? And there's a lot of things you can do for those three things that don't require you to purchase something, right?
Yeah.
So there is, and so sometimes what I recommend is what people are really purchasing a lot of times is structure and accountability, right? So if you want to save time by getting a structured course on the thing that you have identified that you need, or if you want to get a coach because you realize you need accountability for it, that's when you might, end up paying for something. But most ideas out there, they're on blogs, they're free to do. You just have to be able to do them. And so that's where people end up paying, because they either need the structure, somebody to put in order for them, or they need the accountability. But the actual act of self-care, plenty of free things. And so if you're going to pay for someone who has done the research and the structure, or pay for accountability, but you do not have to pay for self-care itself.
So you mentioned asking for help, and I appreciate in terms of what you shared in terms of the addressing the privilege piece. And you mentioned one of the ways that we can get self-care is to reach out for help. How does someone know if they're at a point where it's not just a matter of getting sleep or getting enough water, that they actually need to see a professional, perhaps a mental health professional or someone else that might be trained in a specific area?
Right. So I think one is if you feel like your stress is sustained, right? So if you feel like there's a high level of stress every single day and you can't figure out how to get out the loop, that is what professionals are really good, is kind of stopping you from getting off the hamster wheel, if you will, because you need someone to help you recognize your blind spots.
Yes.
So that's where help can be beneficial, because oftentimes you can't recognize your blind spot. So a blind spot that I had was I didn't realize how much my sense of time, or lack thereof, was making me stressed out, because I was not realizing how long it took me to do things, how long it took me to get to places. And so that was causing stress, right? So little things like always, like if I was riding the metro, and because I didn't have a very good sense of time, I would underestimate, or as I call it, a time optimist. I was a time optimist that I could get from A to B, whether I was in the metro or if I was driving, right? I was a time optimist that I could get A to B in a certain amount of time. And no matter how many times I never got there in a certain amount of time, I never changed my behavior to say, hey, give yourself more time, because it was just like I was just trapped in this loop, and it was becoming very, very stressful, right?
And you just have faith in yourself. That's all, right?
Right. A time optimist, right? But it causes issues, right? Because now, Miko's waiting for me, right? So Miko's upset because he's like, Aisha's late again, right? So Miko's waiting for me. So that's not a good thing. So then you feel guilty about that. But there was just something that there was not a switch I couldn't flip to get me out of that loop. And so that was one of the things that my therapist recognized in me, was able to put that mirror up to me to say, hey, because a lot of times when we're stressed out, we're blaming everybody else. We're like, this person did this and this person did that. And she was just like, well, one of the things that might be an issue that you don't give yourself enough time. And so therefore you're always very, very hurried. And then, as they say, Murphy's Law, what will happen at the worst possible time. And that was always happening to me. And all it took was for me to give myself more time to do things, right? And so again, giving myself more time to do things, that's free. But I was caught in this really, really high pressure situation that was very, very fast paced. And I needed that professional help to get me out of the loop, right?
Did you have to reach a crisis point in order to ask for that kind of help? Or what helped you get to that point where you said, I need a third party professional to help me at this point?
Yeah, for me, it was a crisis situation. I was definitely in a crisis situation where I was under sustained stress, right? And so it was external, because there was external stress coming upon me. But because I had never had appropriate self-care or coping behaviors, I couldn't help myself, right? So I think that's the other thing, like learning, how to actually cope with stress. is very, very important, because now I can't even say that I'm under less stress, because I'm still kind of in the same environment, but I deal with it very, very differently by setting boundaries, managing my time, and managing my mindset every morning, and then making sure that my self-care comes first, right? So all the things that I enjoy doing are no longer on the back burner. They're no longer someday maybe, because I understand that joy is a type of fuel that's very, very important for me as well. So we talked about water, we talked about sleep, but joy and doing things for meaning is a type of fuel as well. And so now, because I know I got that covered, in other places where it's stressful, I'm like, well, I'm already happy because I did the thing that I love to do, as opposed to being resentful that all of the things that are stressing me out are taking up all of my time, and then I'm too exhausted to do something that's joyous.
So to this point about you reaching the crisis point, can you give the audience an example so people understand for themselves, that they're trying to figure out like where they are? How do they know if they're at a? Can you give an example so people understand? Like, are they at a crisis point, or are they at a point where they just need more sleep? They just need to take a nap and they're gonna be good, or they need to actually like call a therapist.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk about two things. So the first thing I'm gonna talk about is what's called personal craziness. And so I find the word craziness a little stigmatizing, but that's the term that the person who came up with it used. But so I'm going to call it personal chaos. Okay. And what that is that this comes from the world of addiction, and they can show that there's really small everyday behaviors that when they start to slip, it's a signal for someone that they may be about to relapse. But but people have taken it and applied it to show like you're on the brink of burnout if you start to notice these things. And again, it's different for everyone. So what they recommend is to find 7 things that if you did those things, then your life is in order. And if you find yourself constantly not doing those things, you might be at risk for burnout and needing professional help, right? And so you got 7 things, 7 days, right? So the maximum we can have is what? Let me test your math, Miko. 7 times 7 is what?
49.
49, right? So you want to give yourself a score. So if you have a score of 49 or 35 over, then we need to be seeking professional help. If we're, in the teens, then we just maybe need to do some, sleep or just get our routines back together. So it can be in many areas, right? So one of them is just like home life, right? So are your dishes dirty and your laundry's not done and your plants are dying, right? So we all have one of those.
And that's a normal thing for this backup. So that's that's a normal thing for you to be on top of, right? So like if you're not good with the plants and that's just not an issue for you, then
right. So that's why you have to identify your 7 things, right? But sometimes it's just, if it's just like one thing, like, well, okay, I got the plants in order, I got the dishes done, but the laundry's not done. So that's just one little thing, right? Yeah. But if it's the plants are dying and the laundry's not done and the dishes are dirty and you lost your keys 5 times this week and you were running late every day, so you ran all these stop signs, and then you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're not taking care of responsibilities at work. And so like it's about that cumulative effect of all these little things, because we all have some of them, right? Yeah. Like right now, I have some laundry that needs to come out of the dryer, but it's still in there, right? But if I have all of those things, it creates a lot of chaos, right, in your life. And so if you have too much of those little pieces of chaos, another like haven't opened the mail, checking account overdrawn, right? So you can have one of those things every now and then. But if like we said, the maximum number is 49, right? So in a course of a week, you've got 49 little breakdowns that can be a sign that you're on the brink of burnout, right? So that's the first thing. And if you have a question about that, we can talk about that. Then I can give you the second thing.
I was going to say that I refer to it as the personal chaos index when I work with clients. I'm not sure if that's a term other people are using or if I got that from somewhere else. But,
yeah. So I wrote about it, and then Beth Cantor wrote about it, and then so the loop, our little friend loop. It went through the friend loop. I did a speaking engagement. A lady at a speaking engagement told me, and then I told Beth, and then she probably got to you.
Okay. Well, awesome. So I'm glad we're able to help people in one form or another. So what's the second thing that you wanted to mention as it relates to this?
So the second thing is about, looking at how your body feels, right? So we talk about feelings, and a lot of times we think of them like as emotional qualities, but like
Yeah.
our body like feels
Sensations.
sensation, right? It
Yes.
feels. And so we have to think out like starting from our head, right? So if you start to lose focus, have headaches all the time, that could be a sign of stress. It all can be a sign of dehydration. So drink the water, and if the headache doesn't go away, it could be stress, right? Stress also lowers our immune system. So if we are often getting sick more than we usually do, that kind of thing, that can be a sign that we're under stress. If we find ourselves with lots of shallow breathing, like a lot of us don't breathe deeply, right? That's a sign of stress. And it's a sign to our bodies, right? Because again, when you're running away from the tiger, you're panting, you're breathing heavy, right? When you're late for something, you're holding your breath while you're driving and everybody is in your way. So that is a sign, can be a sign of stress. Digestive issues. A lot of people, when you have stress and anxiety, have digestive issues. So that's something to pay attention to as well. And then there's some stuff that we can't even feel, right? So it can also lower our sex drive when we are under stress, right? So if you find yourself in a relationship and you become disinterested in sex, and you're not sure why, right? The person, they still look good to you, but that can be a sign. So there's also like the physical signs on the body, and so those are the ones when you really need to act.
So you mentioned something that triggered a thought about interpersonal relationships. So whether it's in personal relationships at home, like you mentioned, in the romantic context, or at work, how do you support someone if you're the observer and you think someone might be in this category where they're not on the crisis spectrum, but they've ticked off enough of those 7x7s that it might be worth their while to pay attention to some of those things. How do you recommend folks have that conversation, or is it even appropriate for you as an observer to have that conversation with someone?
Yeah, I think people have to learn to have that conversation, because when I started having certain realizations, there were people like, "Oh yeah, you've always been that way," and I was like, "Well, why didn't y'all say anything?" Like people, like my cousins and stuff, like, "Oh, you've always been that way," and I'm like, "Well, so maybe it wasn't at problematic levels when I was younger, but there are definitely things that people did notice, right?" And so I think in interpersonal relationships, the one thing you can do is we talked about asking for help, right? But if that person has that blind spot and doesn't realize help could be the thing that could solve a problem for them, just ask them, what do they need? Make a recommendation. So, because sometimes people don't even know what they need, right? But if you see what they need, say, "Hey, I can do X, Y, Z for you. Would that be helpful for you?" And usually they'll be like, "Oh, yes," because people sometimes don't like to ask other people for help. That's a whole another conversation we can have. So knowing that, sometimes you have to then be the person to say that, like for my new mom, sometimes I was like, "I'm going to come over and, watch the baby while you sleep." But they would probably never ask me to do that. I have to bring it to the table. So I think you can bring some of those things to the table. And I think other is just like, showing, I think you have to show people, and you can't really tell people. So when I first got into self-care, I was like telling everybody, "You should do this, you should do that." And people were getting so annoyed with me. And then I just had to show that and let them see that my life was better, that I was less of a hot mess than I was before. And then they were like, "Oh," they would either ask me about it, or I would notice they would start doing those things themselves.
Yes.
So they could see that it was working for me. And sometimes I would drop little hints. I'd be sure to be like, "Oh, such and such is really working for me," but I would never say, "And you should do it too." So I think a lot of times we have to leave out the "and you should do it too," but you can mention things that are working for you. You can offer to help people. And then the other thing about, making sure you have time for joy and meaning in your life, inviting people to things, to say, "Hey, I'm going to buy a ticket, to this nature walk," kind of thing. Do you want to go? And that person might just say yes. And even if they say no, it's okay, because that's your job as, a friend, is to make the offer.
So I'll have us touch on this last topic, and then we can talk about how people can work with you and if there's something else that you want to add to this conversation that we haven't discussed already. But I'm curious, given where we are in the current environment, where lots of folks are working from home, one of the big requests I'm seeing right now from organizations is how to sustain a culture of well-being, given that it's essentially remote for people that are non-essential workers. So in the context of self-care, do you have any suggestions or tips for folks that are looking to create or sustain a culture of self-care within their organizations, or even in the home environment where you want to create and sustain a culture of self-care in your family?
Sure. So I think right now, especially because we have people homeschooling in the midst of a pandemic and have their regular job they may have to do at home, can be complicated. And so I think organizations have to be as flexible as they can. And I think that conversation needs to be had, right? What does this mean? And talk about what the boundaries are, right? Because now it's like, well, that person doesn't commute anymore, so maybe I can get, 3 more hours out of them, that kind of thing, and really talk about that culture and what that culture could be. So I've been talking to some people about mutual aid. Can we come up with ways to provide mutual aid? So kind of just like even a little list for people to say, I need, and other people can say, I can give, right? Yes. And you kind of just naturally match yourself up. So I think that's something that I think people should definitely try as part of like their culture. But on an individual level, there's 2 tips that I would give. So the first one is when you're done working, actually press close on all of the tabs on your computer, right? So close them out so that there's no chance for like that notification, or you just walk by and you see something you want to respond. So close out the tabs, close the laptop all the way, put it in your laptop bag that if you were using that before, or put it in a drawer. So you can signal to yourself that work is over, right? Put your papers away, close everything down. So that way there's like not that temptation. And then I will go, if my phone is near me, if I've been using my phone, I'll go put it on the charger in a room that's different from where I am. So I make sure to like have some sort of ritual that signals the end of the workday, right? And that's for you to decide when you want that to end, because you may be doing a different schedule during this time, but physically close it down. The second tip I would recommend is to replace your commute, because many people are like, I don't have time for self-care, right? Well, if you've been able to get rid of your commute and it hasn't been replaced with homeschooling, right? And if you're homeschooling, try to at least replace one of the commutes. Replace it with self-care, right? So that is a time where you're like, okay, so I have this extra hour that I am not commuting, right? And I would, if I really want to tell you, take not only your commute time, take your getting dressed time and all that too, but we'll just stick with your commute time. Take that hour on either end if you have that commute, and replace that with the things that you never were able to get to. You were always like, well, I'm too tired at the end of the day to do this particular thing. Replace it with that. And I think right now, because our minds are so overwhelmed with all the intake for information, because it's hard to figure out what's the line of being informed versus overwhelmed by information, right? So I definitely recommend people, do things that are really good for the mind. So meditation, reading, coloring, puzzle. So right now I am really into the New York Times mini crossword. That seems to be at my like skill level, the real crossword, the mini crossword. I'm doing that. They also have a spelling bee and this other thing called tiles. So I've been doing those every day, and I've been geeking out on these things. Like these are things I didn't do before, but I needed new self-care things because I had, I kind of got bored with the ones that I had, right? And I needed some new things during this time. So I seriously recommend like closing down and then doing some sort of alternate commute.
Yes. And I love that. So Carlos and I talked about that during our conversation about, I forget, what was it, about tech distraction, Carlos, if you're still there. And I use the analogy or the metaphor of Mr. Rogers. Right, he came in before he taught his lesson, sang his song. He had a switching ritual where he put on his sweater and changed his shoes, and he did that at the start and at the end, right? And so I think you hit on something spot on about having the stop rituals and what I call reclaiming our commute time, particularly when it comes to digital wellness, right? So that is, as you mentioned, it's an important cue that we're missing now because it gives our body, our mind, our spirit an opportunity to switch. And so what we once took for granted, being stuck in traffic or being on the metro or stopping to get the Starbucks coffee or even the idle chit chat in the break room before start of the day or during the breaks throughout the day, those are really important opportunities for you to switch context and to take a break, right? To allow your brain and other parts of yourself to just decompress and take a break. So you're spot on with that. And then you touched on something that I thought was really, really important in terms of I think I lost my thought temporarily, but you were talking about the switching part. What was the second part of what you mentioned?
The switching and then the replacing the commute.
Okay. Yeah. So the replacing the commute. So you mentioned news. So that was what I wanted to talk about. So you mentioned that the news and information, overwhelm and overload. And so I promise this will be the last question. But so what are your thoughts on strategies for how people can approach this, right? So how do people, deal with the anxiety about wanting to know what's going on and wanting to stay informed enough to keep themselves and their family and their loved ones healthy, but at the same time not being consumed by all that's out there?
Yeah. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to stop sorting. And what I mean by that is stop accepting all information feeds into your life. So you have to sort them out. So you have to sort out what's true, what's not true, what's fake news, what's satire, right? And what's just plain old, like, I don't know, just not even real things, right? And so I think part of it is that especially on social media and other places, we allow so much information that we have to sort. Yeah. And that sorting is an energy drain, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of energy drains right now, especially because of uncertainty, right? So even if, again, this is one of those things in your body that you can't feel, but right now, all of us are an idling car. We're just we're sitting there, we're on, but we're not necessarily going anywhere because we don't know where the end of this is. But that doesn't mean the battery isn't getting drained. It may be getting drained very slowly, and that's one of the reasons why we have less energy. So that's our baseline now. And then we've given ourselves this extra task of sorting. So we need to stop sorting. And so the way that we can do that is we need to figure out what sources we deem credible and focus on those sources, right? And not only like publications, but maybe there's a particular person that you deem credible. So get your news from 1 to 3 sources that you have already deemed credible, right? And so maybe there's one that you kind of agree with. There's maybe another one that has a slightly different perspective, but it's well researched and credible. So just focus on that and don't read and let all of the random things come in, because then we have to start that whole sorting process. So I started subscribing to the New York Times and the Washington Post. So now that I can go directly to those news sources and scan the headlines. And so I know I'm not going to see any foolish headlines. I'm not going to see anything too outlandish. I don't have to be I have to be critical, but I don't have to be skeptical of their information, right? And so it's taken so much stress off of me to completely get rid of trying to sort through facts and information and just go straight to the sources that I have already deemed they've met criteria that will help me know that what I'm reading I can rely on.
I think that's extremely important. In the context of digital wellness, I talk about the same concept, and I talk about it as curating your feeds and using tools like Feedly or Pocket to put those things in one place so that you don't have to go searching all over. When you're ready to consume that, you can go to that place and you know that all of those feeds that you have curated are going to be in that one place, and you don't have to go searching for where it is. So that takes you less time, is less taxing. The other aspect of that is that it allows you the opportunity to break out of the breaking news cycle, which I think is one of the other challenges, right? Because the breaking news cycle, often it's not really relevant news for you, and it's often incomplete. And so one of the other strategies that I would recommend to folks is to look for sources that provide summaries of complete news, right? So once all the facts are in, look for something that's going to provide a summary. So the PBS NewsHour, they do a weekly summary on Fridays and Mondays about what's happening in the political environment. NPR does something similar. There are lots of podcasts that are really short. They do the same thing, but finding what the balance is for folks in that regard. So I appreciate you sharing it. It's such an important thing for us to think about, as I think Beth Cantor would call it, information hygiene, making sure that we are being mindful of that. So as we close out today, can you tell us a little bit about what you have upcoming? How can folks work with you if they find themselves on the spectrum where they're in need of support with self-care, or they need a referral to someone if they're in a crisis situation? Like, how do they get in contact with you? How do they reach you?
Sure. So the main way you can reach me is via my website, and that is selfcarebyAisha.com. And then my digital social media homes are Instagram and Facebook. So you can find me as Self-Care by Aisha on both of those. So what do we have coming up right now is this is a very time-sensitive opportunity. So I was supposed to be doing a live workshop here in DC in March, but that was canceled because of COVID. And so now I've had to retool and turn that into an online workshop. So that's actually happening this Saturday, May 30th from 1 to 4 p.m. And so we had two levels. The VIP level is sold out because the VIP folks got a special self-care box, which I put in the mail today. But I still have tickets left for people who just want to attend and get the information without getting the VIP online experience box, right? So the workshop is called Planting the Seeds of Self-Care. And we will start with some inspirational stories from women who have taken time and really retooled their life around self-care. And then I'll do a little workshop called Planting the Seeds of Self-Care, where we will talk about what we need to get rid of from our lives in order to move forward and have the life that we really want, in terms of having a lower stress life and not being under constant stress, and also what seeds of self-care do we want to plant. And then we'll have a paint and sip party. That's going to be fun, right? So people will do some art projects and sip, and we'll have a live DJ recording. So I really feel like this event is going to be better than what was going to take place in person. So that's on the homepage of selfcarebyAisha.com, where you can learn more about planting the seeds of self-care. So that's going to take place, this online experience. So it'll be on Zoom, but it's not going to be a Zoom meeting. It's an online experience. Let me be clear.
Interactive experience, yes.
Right, as Obama would say, let me be clear. That's an interactive experience that's going to take place. So that is the first thing that's happening this Saturday.
All right. So online interactive self-care retreat. We're going to paint and hydrate. If you get the VIP box, you got something extra special to be included with that. Then that is selfcarebyAisha.com and at Self-Care by Aisha on Facebook and on Instagram. So we've had a wide-ranging conversation about so many things, and you've dropped so many gems and nuggets for our audience. Is there anything else that you feel like it's important for our audience to know, or that you just want to touch on before we wrap up today?
Make self-care a part of your new normal. We have a chance to, we've all had to stop and do things differently. And we have a chance to be intentional about how we operate going forward. So I would love for everyone to take self-care into their new normal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aisha, for joining us. Carlos, if you're there, any last parting words before we sign off for this week?
Aisha, thank you so much for your time today. I mean, just some takeaways from myself in terms of just own personal self-care and the investment in that. One thing that I also heard, Aisha, just this idea of engaging in dialogue and in an employment from an employment perspective, and engaging in dialogue with either management or staff to see how we can support each other around self-care as well, right? So thank you for sharing that. We're going to take the notes and the links that you shared with us today and put it in the edited version of this video so that we can blast that out and ensure that people can gain access to these upcoming conversations that you have.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you both. And audience, we'll be tuning in next week. We'll be talking about how to work virtually in a mindful and an intentional way. And so you don't want to miss that conversation. And again, thank you, Aisha, for having us. And Carlos, thank you for hosting us in this awesome studio you put together.
Yeah, you guys have a great day. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.
All right.
Thank you.